Angel. Second part, Angel. Father Charles Murr. Angel. We're gonna watch it, okay? Angel. Okay. Don't move, Angel. Angel. Smile. Show your teeth. Angel.
And then the Catholic Church is. So I started to make a little study of Pius XII, and in that process, I went into the question of Rabbi Zoli. And I met Rabbi Zoli's daughter.
Did you? Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
What year was this?
1998.
Wow.
That's 26 years ago. And my father was with me. He came to Rome. That was only the 5th year of the magazine. I started it in 93. And Miriam Zoli was a very noble, calm, impressive Italian woman of Jewish background, but had become Catholic. She said, my father wanted us to be Catholic with him. He was so misunderstood and mistreated by the Jewish community. His name,
I'm sure.
He was the chief rabbi of Rome. After he converted, his name was taken off the list, and you do not find it. He's canceled. And in addition, there's a story that I found out about, which has to do with the whole question of telling the truth about history and telling lies about history, which Mother Pasqualina taught you about, and Cardinal Gagnon taught you about, and I've discovered it from other people myself, including Archbishop Vigano. But the problem is that in 1944, the American army came in, and that summer, the Jewish synagogue of Rome was reopened. And Rabbi Zoli met with the rabbi of the Allied forces, whose name was Rabbi Morris Kertzer. And Morris Kertzer and he reopened the Grand Synagogue of Rome on the Tiber River in 1944. And in early 1945, Rabbi Zoli, now in complete safety in Italy, went to the Gregorian University, met with the rector, whose name was Paolo Dezza, Father Dezza.
Oh, sure, Father Dezza, yes. I knew him.
Well, Dezza was the man who many years later, almost 30 years later, was chosen by John Paul II to step in and replace Father Arupe as the leader of the Jesuits. And everyone...
And not only to step in and replace him, to put the Jesuits back in order. This was the whole idea.
Yeah, and I don't know how... we'll come to the question of the Jesuits in another broadcast, but...
another few broadcasts. They deserve 3 or 4.
Yeah, but Paolo Dezza, the Jesuit, listened to Eugenio Zoli. He said his name was not Eugenio yet, say that he had seen a vision of Jesus in the synagogue, calling him to follow him, and telling him that from the time he was a child, something in his heart was moved by the candles that he saw at Christmas. He grew up in Trieste, and that he wrote a book called Before the Dawn. The dawn was his faith in Christ. But before the dawn was this long period of being Jewish in early 20th century Europe, being fascinated by this figure who was a Jew, who was crucified, who was regarded as a criminal and really in some way as a blasphemer by the Jewish community, but who was the center of the Christian civilization around him.
Yeah.
These questions are tremendously important. We are wrestling with them. They've been part of what I've been wrestling with for 50 years now. When I first came to Rome in the 80s, I met Joseph Lichten, who had been present at the Second Vatican Council as a representative of B'nai B'rith. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith representative in Rome was Joseph Lichten. We talked on many occasions, and he told me that he was involved in the whole question of Nostra Aetate and everything else at the Second Vatican Council. But this question of Rabbi Zoli died in 1956, impoverished. He gave some lectures at Notre Dame as a converted Jewish rabbi, but nobody supported him or gave him much money. His daughter, Miriam, who by then was about 80 years old, told me that she felt deeply Catholic. She was a believer in Jesus and part of the Catholic Church because her father had converted, as well as her mother, to the great sadness of the Jewish community of Rome. But she went with her father, and that nevertheless she felt very Jewish. She said, I am a Jew. And she said, I want you to realize, and her daughter was there at the dinner with my father, Maura de Bernard, who is still a professor in Bologna. And my father wanted to pay for the meal, and which was about a 2-hour conversation. You know how it can be in Rome. And
Yes, easily. Sure.
In Trastevere. And Miriam Zoli turned to my father and said, here, I am the matrona. I am the matron. I am the person who invites you to dinner. And she paid for the meal. And my father and I left the dinner, walked up the hill, the Janiculum Hill, and he said, this is somehow very important. He said, I can't even express how important. So she passed away later. Haven't been in touch with Maura, and I think she probably is still alive. But here's the book now that's just come out by, can you see it?
I can see it. Papa in Guerra.
Papa in Guerra, David Kertzer. So this came out just a little more than a year ago, and I was in Rome, and the book came out. David Kertzer is a very accomplished and well-known and prize-winning historian. The Jewish historian, his father was Rabbi Morris Kertzer, who was with the American Army, who came into Rome. His father was the one who celebrated the opening of the Rome synagogue later in 1944, just before Zoli converted.
With Zoli, yes, okay.
With Zoli. So Kertzer and I sat down at the American Academy in Rome, which is where I was a fellow in 1985, 86, in medieval history. And I talked to him about this book where he says Pius XII didn't do enough. That's the essential thing. And he's gone to the Vatican. Remember, the Vatican archives weren't opened until about 3 years ago. And Kertzer, with several others on his team, were the first to go in and look at the Vatican archives. And he says, too many cases where Pius didn't act, where he didn't speak, and he was absolutely taking the opposite position that you've been promoting during this whole first half of our program, that Pius XII was wise. He didn't speak because it saved more lives. Kertzer is attacking him. But then I asked, what was your father's relationship with Rabbi Zoli? He said, well, he appreciated Rabbi Zoli very much. And even after he converted, he didn't criticize him. Mm. And then he told me that in 2014, there was 14 plus 56 is 7, the 70th anniversary of the reopening of the Synagogue of Rome after it had been closed for a year by the Nazis. And they invited him to come because he was the son of the rabbi who reopened it. And they put the big poster out. They said, the reopening by Morris Kertzer of the Roman synagogue. And I said, but what about Zoli? He said, well, they left Zoli's name off. And I said, well, wasn't Zoli there with your father when they reopened it? And he said, yes, he was. And I said, well, didn't that bother you as a historian? And he said, well, it did. And I mentioned it to them. They said, he's been canceled. We can't name him now, even though he was there in 1944. So part of me feels a wound for the sake of Miriam, with whom I had dinner, who paid for my dinner. And my father and I felt a deep respect for her. And as a Jewish woman and as a Catholic woman, if I may say something as paradoxical. And
Not paradoxical. That's not. It makes. Listen, who are all of our first saints? They're all Jews, of course.
yeah,
Of course, and we proudly admit it.
and so somehow this is run down through the ages and remains even today an issue of supreme importance, Father Murr.
Yeah.
And
I just can tell you this, that if you know, look, hindsight is 20/20. We've heard that, we believe that, we know it, we've experienced it. Put yourself in the middle of a war and try to figure out what is best to do to save the most amount of human lives. It is nothing easy. It is nothing easy. And you know, I'm gonna tell you something else too, Robert, something that I don't know if it's even true today. I sure hope it is. I sure hope it is. But when I was a young man in Rome, and a young man growing up, and when I was a boy, any Protestant, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, anyone in the world with a problem could write to the Pope of Rome. Did you know that? Legally, any human being had access to the Pope of Rome because one of his titles was the father of fathers, or the father of all nations on earth. He was considered the father, and you had legal recourse to him through canon law. This didn't know any boundaries. And I used to love that. I don't know if that holds true anymore today. Probably not, practically speaking. But I thought, idealistically speaking, it was so beautiful that he was the father to anyone could approach him with a problem. Not just approach him with a problem, a legal problem. And I know very well that the Vatican also helped in certain cases, especially Jewish Germans and Austrians, to get their properties and things back after the war. They helped in that. War is a messy business, and it's never clean. It's never clean. There are people killed on both sides. It's an awful state. It's why we want to avoid it constantly, and it's forever if we possibly can. No one comes out completely clean. But I know Pius XII did everything in conscience that he possibly could do to help and not to have more people killed. Right? There was again the great Cardinal of Munster, Van Galen. Van Galen. But every time Van Galen spoke very clearly against Hitler and against the Nazis, and every time he did on a Sunday Mass at Cathedral in Munster, by Monday, by Tuesday, by Wednesday, he was missing priests. They were rounded up and taken away. So it's a hard deal to survive a war, and it's almost impossible to survive absolutely purely clean. Pius XII did everything that he could. Mother Pasqualina told me that everything he possibly could, he did. He listened to everybody and did as much as he possibly could. And she also told me that during those war times, there were times where there wasn't food sufficient for the papal dining room. We're talking about having a bowl of soup, and there wasn't food. There just wasn't food. But the heroics of Pius to call on Franco to send over food to keep these people alive for 9 months, so that they would not be taken away by the Nazis, I thought was fantastic. Now, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. Right after, this is post-war, but it was in the early 1960s. Perhaps it was in the late 50s, but by the 60s, everybody had heard about it. There was another German,
yes,
a Marxist, by the way, a Marxist, who wrote a book called The Deputy.
yes.
And that is when I remember criticism of Pius XII being made public. Who is the author of that?
Rolf Hoch.
That's right, Rolf Hoch.
Hoch.
How do you spell that, his last name?
Hochhuth. Hochhuth.
Right.
And
He wrote The Deputy.
People say
Yes.
he was paid. He was in Eastern Germany, and
Yes.
people say he was paid by the Russians. But the
He was
Russians,
paid,
the Soviets,
As a matter of fact, they proved that he was paid by the Soviets, by the Marxists, by fellow Marxists to write that book. That play was a play.
and it meant the deputy of Hitler. In other words, the person who listened to and served the wishes of Adolf Hitler. And so the German author in Eastern Germany of a leftist background relaunched a new understanding of Pius XII in a play, which was quickly performed here, there, and everywhere, showing that Pius XII may have appeared to be a wonderful pope, but secretly was the deputy of Hitler.
That's right. And he was a Marxist, the author was a Marxist, and it was sponsored and paid for by Marxism from Russia. So I think much said. Here, based on the KGB sponsored play. Yep.
There's still the person sitting in the Stell is positioned and Vertreter is holder. So it's the deputy, really. That's the translation. The person who stands in the position. But this is the difference from the late 40s and all during the 50s when Israel and Golda Meir and others were saying, thank you, Pius XII, we appreciated you. When people who had gone through that period were living in Rome, who later in the 90s I was able to talk to as they were 80 or 90 years old. I found a dozen or more of them. I think
That's
now
incredible.
they're all passed away, but still there would be children of them. If we really made an intensive effort, we might be able to find several dozen family diaries and family memories of people who were hidden by the Catholic Church during the war. But at least I do have evidence of a number. And Pius was responsible for that. He ordered it to occur. And there were reports that he might risk being taken by the Nazis from the Vatican, put into prison, perhaps even executed. So he did this courageously, saying, I'm not afraid, I don't mind if they take me and execute. I think there was an instruction that if he was taken, they shouldn't regard the papacy as still being held by, but choose someone else to continue the papacy if he was going to be held for the rest of his life in a Nazi prison. And you were saying, for us to judge these times is difficult. The Soviets had this enormous empire. The Nazis had conquered all of Europe. The Americans were waiting to see what to do. Who knew what was going to be the result of all this? The Vatican stood in between the German Nazis, who were a racially focused nation. They thought Christianity was a kind of weak dissolution of their national identity.
Yes.
And the other side was the communists in Russia, who were officially atheists.
Yes. Yes. No, that's you talk about being between a rock and a hard place. I mean, this is exactly what the situation was. There were horrible situations. But I'm telling you, and I talked long and hard with Mother Pasqualina about those years. There's one other thing I wanted to tell you, that there was the bombing of Rome.
Hi, I'm back.
The bombing of Rome also took place, and that was done by people keep thinking it's the Nazis that bombed Rome. It wasn't the Nazis; it was the English and the Americans. As a matter of fact, if you go into Vatican City, Robert, you know the train station.
Yes,
The train station has two bas reliefs in marble on the outside. One is from the Old Testament, one is from the New Testament. The Old Testament is Elijah taken up in the fiery chariot. And the New Testament is Christ in the boat with his disciples. two modes of travel. It's on the train station, right?
Yeah.
Two modes of travel, Old and New Testament travel. But the shrapnel from the bombs that went off in Vatican City are still in the back of the basilica and on the train station. Those bombs went, yes.
I didn't know that there actually was shrapnel that hit the Vatican. I thought it was out at San Lorenzo.
Oh yeah, no. If you go, the next time you go back in, go up to the train station. You'll see big pieces missing out of the wall. Also, the backside of St. Peter's Basilica still had, unless they repaired them within the last 20 years, but there were big pieces missing from where a bomb had fallen. And San Lorenzo, the Basilica of St. Lawrence, was bombed terribly. And Pius XII as soon as the bombs started hitting that horrible day, Pius XII was in San Lorenzo before they even knew he had left the Vatican. He grabbed his car. And he asked Mother Pasqualina for all the money they had, all the money that was available right there. She got it, I don't know from where, gave it to him, and he himself took his driver and was in San Lorenzo in the middle of the crowd who were crying that their houses were bombed and everything else, giving out money to people. He had 2 Monsignori there helping to immediately to do something. And he made a long distance call, Robert. This is almost historic because I think it was one of the first in the world. It was a transatlantic call, and it was a conference call. And it was between the President of the United States, Roosevelt, I believe it was Roosevelt. Yes, it was Roosevelt at the time.
Yes, it was.
And Churchill and Pius XII. And Pius XII, that same day or the next day, he promised them that if they ever bombed Rome again and caused destruction to the cradle of civilization, he called it of Western civilization, Rome, he would make sure that the next time he was hit by the bombs, he would be under there. So they could be also not only judged guilty of destroying Western civilization's cradle, but also the father of Christianity, the Pope.
Okay.
He was that serious, all right? And so you've got this man playing on all different levels, trying to bring peace into the world and to stop chaos and destruction and death. It's very unfair to judge him harshly. Pardon me, but the man has everything in place for his canonization. Everything is in place for his canonization, and they're holding it up for political reasons. Right now, just one other thing, Robert, if I may say, and I promise to shut up after this.
I don't know.
One of the reasons that many Israelis and Jews throughout the world disliked the Vatican, disliked and still dislike, is because the Vatican refused to have diplomatic relations with Israel.
That's right.
Right? Now, the reason for that was very simple. It wasn't because the Vatican is anti-Semitic. That's not the reason they didn't have diplomatic relations with Israel. The reason was that they had diplomatic relations with all of the Arab nations. And if they would have diplomatic relations with Israel, they would have to give up those other relations. They were at that time, during the 50s and 60s, absolutely deaf to the idea of the Vatican having relations with them and with Israel. They stopped it. So the Vatican maintained this because the Vatican the Vatican had an open gate to all of these Muslim nations, at least diplomatically, that they did not want to lose.
Of course.
John Paul II came along and he said, no, the time now is to recognize Israel, and he did. But for years, look, I told you the story of Monsignor Hilarion Capucci. It's in my book, The Syrian, where Capucci was able to go to see the Khomeini and save the lives. A lot of people don't know that, saved the lives of the hostages, the American hostages at the embassy in Tehran. Well, he could do that through the Vatican diplomacy. at the time.
Yeah.
This is anyway. There are a lot of things that are different, but to say, for example, to say that the Vatican hates Israel or the Vatican hates the Jews, this is absurd. It's not. It's absurd. It's a sin. It's a mortal sin to be running around saying stupid things like that because it's so injurious. But it's just not that way. It's just not that way. But there is a black legend that has been going on since certainly since
1962.
certainly since the Spanish Armada was defeated. All right, I'm telling you, that's true. Historically, it was called the Black Legend, and it exists today. All about the Inquisition and the this and the hatred for the Jews and the, come on. This is just if it was true, it was true of different individuals, sinners who belong to the Catholic Church. We understand that every other religion and every other nation has them. This is it, but this is never the official stance of the Catholic Church, and the Church itself did everything to be Christian.
Yeah. Well, we started our conversation saying today is October 16th, 2024.
It is indeed.
And 81 years ago on October 16th in Rome, nearly 1,000 Jews were rounded up by the Gestapo, but many thousands more were not rounded up because they found refuge. About more than 80%, I would say almost 90%, were found safety. Some of these people I even talked to many years later in the 1990s, the early 2000s, I found them. But starting in about 1962, the legend arose that Pius XII had been an evil pope, had been Hitler's sort of deputy. And this has continued, and this is the reason why other popes are being beatified and canonized as saints, but Pius is not. And in many ways, he was more dramatically courageous and Christian
Absolutely.
than some of these. I hate to rank and compare one to the other.
Yes, we know what you're thinking.
But I also wanted to say that the situation now is such that I was going to set into context what you said. The Vatican did not establish diplomatic relations in 1948 when Israel was created, 3 years after the Second World War, until 1993. So that was 45 years. And people were critical of the Vatican, but in all those years, the Christian communities in the Arabic countries needed to be served. This is what you said. I'm just repeating what you said. Because if you don't have access to your Christian communities in Iraq, in Syria, in other Arabic and Muslim countries, they could be in difficulty. You need to represent them and help them. You can't just abandon them. And it was set up in such a way that as the Vatican they were told through diplomatic channels, if you do this and you immediately recognize Israel, you're going to have problems diplomatically in our countries. So they waited.
That's right.
Waited. But you gave a clear explanation also of how useful it was for the Vatican to have these relations, and they helped the American hostages in Iran with your friend, Archbishop Hilarion.
Well, Robert, it's that simple. Archbishop Hilarion Capucci. It was Jimmy Carter who contacted Pope Paul VI. Was it Paul VI? No, I take that back. John Paul the.
It might have been the end of. I think it was. I guess it was.
Angel, we have third part, the final video, Angel. Okay, let's watch Robert Monahan. Okay, so, and Father Charles Murr. Okay, Angel. Okay. Bye-bye. See you in the next video.